Welcome to Ibrahim Traore Person, a channel where hidden truths are uncovered, suppressed voices are amplified, and Africa's untold stories are brought to light. Here, we dive deep into struggles against racism, oppression, and the forces that seek to silence justice. If you're ready to hear stories the world doesn't want you to know, stay tuned, because this is where truth finds its voice. The world watched in silence as whispers turned into tremors. Behind the polished walls of global conferences, secret deals were signed, and Africa's fate was being decided without her consent. But then a soldier rose, not with weapons, but with truth. Ibrahim Traore, a young African leader, stood at the crossroads of history, ready to expose what the West never wanted the world to see. His courage shattered illusions, ignited movements, and forced a reckoning that shook even the most powerful nations. What happens when one man dares to unmask the racist agendas buried deep within international politics? Tonight, we uncover the story that sent shockwaves across the globe. Long before Ibrahim Traore became a global name, Africa was already trapped in a cycle carefully designed to keep it weak. The surface showed foreign investments, aid programs, and smiling handshakes at global summits, but underneath was a web of exploitation, where resources were extracted, leaders manipulated, and entire populations silenced. Colonialism may have ended on paper, but its shadow still lingered across the continent. Countries rich in gold, uranium, and fertile land were left with poverty-stricken villages, broken infrastructure, and economies that could barely stand, without foreign approval. The promise of independence had been replaced by a new system, economic chains disguised as partnerships. It was in this world that Traore, a soldier from Burkina Faso, rose to prominence. He was not born into wealth, nor did he inherit power. His story was rooted in hardship, discipline, and a burning sense of justice. Growing up, he witnessed the struggles of ordinary people, farmers who worked under the scorching sun only to watch their crops undervalued by systems they had no control over. He saw young men migrating in desperation, leaving their families behind, believing there was no future at home. He saw politicians smiling for cameras while quietly bowing to foreign masters. The West sold the idea of development, but it came at a price. Control. Military bases dotted African soil, supposedly for security, yet they guarded resources more fiercely than they protected people. Loans from international banks kept nations dependent, never strong enough to break free. Education systems were molded to value foreign languages over native ones, foreign histories over African achievements. For decades, racism was hidden behind policy papers, development contracts, and so-called aid. It was never about helping Africa rise, it was about keeping it tied down. And yet, there were moments of resistance. Africa has always had voices of defiance. Leaders, thinkers, and revolutionaries who dared to challenge the order. But many were silenced, some removed from power, others erased from history. Every time a voice grew too loud, the machinery of global politics found a way to mute it. This created an atmosphere of fear, where leaders learned that survival meant obedience, and obedience meant surrendering sovereignty. But Ibrahim Traore was different. His rise within the military was not fueled by ambition, but by necessity. He understood that if change did not come from within, it would never come at all. The people of Burkina Faso, like many across Africa, had grown tired of promises. They wanted dignity, ownership, and leaders who would fight for them instead of selling them out. When Traore took his oath as a soldier, he did not see it as a career. He saw it as a responsibility to protect not only borders, but also truth. His early speeches were not grand, but they were sharp. He spoke of sovereignty, of breaking the chains that still tied African nations to their former colonizers. He questioned why Africa, with its wealth of resources, remained the poorest continent. He asked why young Africans had to risk their lives crossing seas in search of opportunities, while their homelands were overflowing with untapped potential. These questions resonated with ordinary people, but they made powerful enemies uneasy. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats whispered his name. They saw in him not just a soldier, but a disruption to their carefully maintained balance. He was young, bold, and unapologetic. He had not yet made his move, but the potential was enough to cause worry. The stage was being set for confrontation, a clash not just of politics, but of truth against deception, dignity against exploitation, and freedom against a system designed to suppress it. The people were watching. Africa was waiting. And Ibrahim Traoré was preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be an option. The shift was not immediate, but it was undeniable. At first, Ibrahim Traoré's voice echoed only within Burkina Faso's borders. He spoke in small gatherings, addressing farmers, workers, and students with the honesty they rarely heard from politicians. He reminded them of their strength, their history, and their potential. Slowly, his words traveled further. Radios carried them to distant villages, videos spread across the internet, and soon, conversations in markets and cafes revolved around the young leader who dared to say what others would not. The people were hungry for truth, and Traoré was feeding that hunger. He didn't sugarcoat reality. He exposed it. He pointed to the gold mines where foreign corporations extracted billions, while local communities remained in poverty. He highlighted the endless loans that enriched international banks but buried African nations in debt. He revealed how foreign troops claimed to fight terrorism but seemed more interested in guarding mineral-rich regions. Each statement struck, like a hammer, breaking the fragile facade of Western benevolence. The rising wave of support unsettled not just local elites but also foreign governments. For years, Africa had been treated as a chessboard where global powers moved pieces at will, but now one of the pawns was refusing to play by the rules. Diplomats sent polite warnings, urging cooperation. Media outlets began to label Traoré as radical, unstable, even dangerous. But the more they tried to smear him, the more people rallied behind him. To them, the attacks confirmed what they already suspected. He was a threat to the system that had kept them poor. This was not just about one leader in one country. Traoré's words resonated across borders. In Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond, people began drawing inspiration from his defiance. African youth, often told their future depended on leaving the continent, now heard a different message: that their strength, dignity, and opportunities lay in reclaiming what was theirs. Students debated his speeches in classrooms, musicians turned his words into songs, and activists carried his image on banners during protests. A movement was taking shape, one that no border could contain. But the rising hope was matched with rising tension. Western governments were not willing to watch their influence crumble without a fight. Economic threats began to surface. Aid could be cut, sanctions imposed, investments withdrawn. Political pressure intensified. Alliances were questioned. Regional leaders urged to distance themselves from Traoré. And lurking beneath it all was the unspoken threat that had haunted Africa for decades: the removal of leaders who dared to stand tall. History was filled with examples and everyone knew the risks. Yet Traoré did not flinch. Instead, he doubled down. He delivered speeches not just in formal settings but on the streets, among the people. He wore his military uniform, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a reminder that he was ready to fight for them. He spoke not in polished diplomatic language but in the raw, passionate words that ordinary citizens understood. "Africa is not poor," he declared. "Africa is being robbed." The statement shook the room when first delivered, and it continued to echo far beyond Burkina Faso. It was more than rhetoric. It was truth wrapped in defiance, and it was dangerous. By naming the exploitation so directly, Traoré crossed a line many before him had avoided. He was no longer simply criticizing policy, he was accusing an entire global system of racism and theft. Crowds grew larger. His popularity soared, and so did the fear in foreign capitals. Reports circulated of instability in Burkina Faso, a familiar tactic used to justify intervention. Commentators questioned whether a man so young could handle leadership, thinly veiling their real concern, that he was too bold, too independent, too unwilling to bend. The rising action was more than political. It was emotional. For the first time in decades, people felt that someone was speaking for them, not at them. A farmer in a remote village could listen to Traoré's words and believe that his suffering was seen. A student in a crowded classroom could imagine a future where their talent wasn't wasted. A mother struggling to feed her children could hope that tomorrow might be different. This was the fuel of the movement. Hope mixed with anger, faith mixed with defiance. And as the world watched, one thing became clear: this was no longer a local matter. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a leader of Burkina Faso. He was becoming the face of a new African resistance, a symbol of the fight against racism disguised as diplomacy, against oppression disguised as development. The question now was not whether the movement would grow, it was how far the system would go to stop it. The moment of reckoning arrived when the quiet murmurs of suspicion erupted into undeniable proof. Traoré stood on an international stage, facing a sea of leaders whose polished smiles barely concealed their unease. Documents, once buried under layers of secrecy, were now projected before the world. Papers revealing how billions in African resources had been siphoned away through so-called development partnerships. What had been framed as aid and cooperation was exposed as exploitation disguised in diplomatic language. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and for the first time in decades, the narrative was not controlled by Western voices but by an African leader determined to dismantle a racist system. The room tensed because this was no longer about backroom negotiations. It was a public unmasking. The climax of years of injustice had arrived, and the West could no longer deny the truth. Traoré's words were sharp yet steady, his evidence irrefutable, his conviction unshakable. This was not just about politics. It was about dignity, justice, and the rewriting of Africa's story before the eyes of the world. The silence that followed was deafening, as those who once mocked his rise now found themselves cornered, unable to hide behind lies any longer. When the echoes of Traoré's words finally settled, the world stood at a crossroads. Western leaders scrambled to downplay the revelations, but the damage was already done. For the first time, millions of Africans saw their struggles and suspicions validated on a global stage. Young people across the continent replayed the speech, on phones and laptops, sharing it like wildfire with hashtags calling for unity and independence. Intellectuals, activists, and ordinary citizens declared that Africa was no longer a passive observer in its own story. It was the author of a new chapter. Though the West tried to disguise panic with polite diplomacy, cracks had already begun to form in their carefully built facade. African nations started reconsidering unfair contracts, leaders questioned long-standing dependencies, and the Global South saw an example of courage that could not be ignored. Traoré's defiance became a symbol far greater than himself. It was a mirror reflecting the hidden racism that had shaped global politics for centuries. Yet the resolution did not mean the fight was over. The road ahead was still lined with obstacles, pressures, and threats. But the impact of this moment could not be erased. History would remember it as the day one man stood tall, tore the mask off racism disguised as aid, and gave Africa permission to believe in its own strength. As the cameras clicked and the world watched in silence, one question lingered like thunder in the hearts of millions. If truth could shake empires in a single speech, what more could Africa achieve when it finally stood together?